Because calcium and phosphate ions are so important in bone homeostasis, we will see the hormones which control the bone homeostasis, and so both calcium and phosphate. Now, the regulation of calcium and phosphate can be categorized into two parts, the hormonal and the non-hormonal way. The non-hormonal way is just when the body recognizes low amounts of calcium and phosphate, and so allows these ions to move out from the hydroxyapatite crystals where they were stored and situated within the bones, into the extracellular fluid and other areas in the body. So this non-hormonal way is usually a quick response. But what if a person's calcium and phosphate levels can't be kept in equilibrium through this process? What about for the long term? Well, this is where the hormonal way comes in. There are three main hormones which control calcium and phosphate concentrations in the body. These are the parathyroid hormone, calcitonin, and vitamin D. Now let's have a look at where each of these hormones come from and concentrate only on the calcium regulation with these hormones, beginning with parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone is a polypeptide hormone and comes from the parathyroid gland, simply enough, which is located somewhere here. And let's zoom into this section. So in this area we can find the pharynx, the thyroid gland, the trachea, and the esophagus. Now the parathyroid gland is found here on the dorsal side of the thyroid gland, meaning the back, and there are actually four parathyroid glands, two on the left and two on the right. These glands consist of a few cells, one of which are called the chief cells. Now these chief cells are the cells which produce and secrete the parathyroid hormones. The parathyroid hormones help increase calcium concentrations when it senses low concentrations of calcium in the plasma. So for example, we have low amounts of calcium in the plasma. The parathyroid gland senses this and secretes the parathyroid hormone, which will then increase calcium concentrations, bringing the calcium concentrations back up to equilibrium. Now let's look at the second hormone. Calcitonin is also a polypeptide hormone, which comes from basically right next to the parathyroid gland, and is referred to as the thyroid gland. So here again we have the same area. We have the pharynx, trachea, and the esophagus. Here is the thyroid gland, and right next to it, as mentioned, is the parathyroid gland, here drawn in black dots. Calcitonin is produced and secreted by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. Calcitonin is also referred to sometimes, or can be referred to as thyrocalcitonin, but let's just keep it simple and call it calcitonin. Now the body senses high calcium concentrations in the plasma, and so the thyroid gland secretes calcitonin, which help lower concentrations of calcium in the body. Calcitonin release is also stimulated by other hormones, such as gastrin, which comes from the duodenum. Now let's see how it works. If we eat a high calcium food, such as fish and milk, it would travel down to the stomach and through the small intestines. An area after the stomach and the beginning of the small intestine is referred to as the duodenum. And the duodenum will sense these high amounts of calcium being eaten, and then will begin secreting gastrin. Now gastrin will stimulate the thyroid glands, which then will release calcitonin, which then will reduce amounts of calcium in the plasma at that current moment. Now why does it do this? Well, because now that there is low amounts of calcium in the plasma, the calcium being consumed by the milk and the fish will now take its place, making it equilibrium. So now let's go over the first two hormones again. So a drop in calcium in the plasma will stimulate the parathyroid gland to secrete parathyroid hormone. Now this parathyroid hormone, which will then cause all the biological effects in the body, which will essentially increase calcium concentrations in the plasma. If the body senses high amounts of calcium in the plasma, this is meant to be high, not low calcium in the plasma. If the body senses high calcium in the plasma, this will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin. Calcitonin will then move around the body and cause all its biological effects, which will then decrease calcium concentrations in the plasma. Now the next hormone, which also regulates calcium concentrations and also phosphate, is vitamin D, or better referred to as vitamin D3, or better yet, 1,2,5-hydroxyl vitamin D3. Why such a complex name? Well, it takes a complex process to produce this 1,2,5-hydroxyl vitamin D3. And this is the type of vitamin D which causes biological changes in the body, increasing calcium and phosphate concentrations. Now let's have a quick look at how it gets synthesized. So you have heard that we get vitamin D from the sun and or diet. Well, there are many types of vitamin Ds. Vitamin D2 we get from food, and vitamin D3 we get from the sun. Well, we don't actually get vitamin D3 directly from the sun. It is actually derived from cholesterol and steroids found in the skin. So when ultraviolet rays hit our skin from the sun, vitamin D3 is produced on the skin. Do you get it? Now the precursor to vitamin D3 found in the skin is 7-dehydrocholesterol. So here we have ultraviolet rays hits the skin where 7-dehydrocholesterol is, and so produces vitamin D3. Now both vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 have little biological effects in the body. Now we will look at the modification of vitamin D3, also known as cholecalciferol, and how it turns into 1,2,5-hydroxyl vitamin D3. Cholecalciferol has many carbon chains. The first change that happens occurs in the liver, with the addition of a hydroxyl to carbon number 25 by a special enzyme within the liver. So now it's called 25 hydroxyl vitamin D3, and then this continues its journey through the bloodstream into the kidneys. In the nephrons, the functional unit of the kidneys, in the proximal tubule, 25 hydroxyl vitamin D3 gets catalyzed by a special enzyme called 1-alpha hydroxylase into 1,2,5 hydroxyl vitamin D3, which then causes all the biological effects, increasing calcium and phosphate concentrations. So let's actually see how each of these hormones affect different parts of the body. So the body senses low plasma calcium and phosphate concentrations, which will then stimulate the parathyroid gland to secrete parathyroid hormone, which will then affect three essential areas: the kidneys, the bone, and the gastrointestinal tract. The parathyroid hormone in the kidneys will cause it to increase the activity of 1-alpha hydroxylase. It will cause it to increase reabsorption of calcium in the distal tubule, but decrease reabsorption of phosphate in the proximal tubule, which will essentially lead to a decrease in phosphate concentrations but an increase in calcium concentrations. Now, parathyroid gland affecting the bone will cause an increase in osteoclastic activity and an increase in maturation of osteoclasts, but a decrease in osteoblast collagen in matrix, which will essentially again decrease phosphate and increase calcium concentration. In the gastrointestinal tract, it will increase both calcium and phosphate absorption. If the body senses low amounts of plasma calcium, it will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin, which will then target the same areas: the kidneys, the bone, and the gastrointestinal tract. Calcitonin in the kidneys will cause it to decrease reabsorption of calcium and phosphate, which will basically result in a decrease in phosphate and calcium concentrations in the body. Yes. Now, calcitonin in the bone will decrease osteoclastic activity, which will then again result in decreased phosphate and calcium. Calcitonin has no effect in the gastrointestinal tract, basically. Also, there's gastrin, which also stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete calcitonin. For vitamin D, or 1,2,5 hydroxyl vitamin D3, it also targets the three areas, the kidneys, the bone, and the gastrointestinal tract. Vitamin D3 in the kidneys causes an increased absorption of calcium and phosphate, which will essentially increase calcium and phosphate concentrations in the body. Vitamin D3 targets the bone, which stimulates the parathyroid hormone actually, which then increases calcium reabsorption only, but decreases phosphate. Vitamin D3 targets gastrointestinal tract, which will increase absorption of calcium and phosphate in the small intestine, which will result in an increase in calcium and phosphate concentrations in the body.